Johnson, I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will do the best of my ability to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. That is all we know about the swearing in of Lyndon Johnson as the 36th President of the United States. Mr. Kennedy's predecessor, General Eisenhower, has issued this statement here in New York on the assassination of the President. Quote, I share the sense of shock and dismay that all Americans feel at the despicable act that resulted in the death of our nation's President. Mrs. Eisenhower and I also join with all other citizens in expressing our personal grief and prayerful concern to Mrs. Kennedy and all other members of the family. The statement issued on behalf of General Eisenhower here in New York this afternoon. Frank?
Bill, the Moscow radio is playing funeral music after announcing the death of President Kennedy, and all diplomats in the Russian capital are described as being aghast. And the United States ambassador to Russia, Voidy Kohler, was told of the news, and his response was to say it's terrible, terrible. Moscow radio quoted reports, and this is Moscow radio now, assuming that extreme right-wing elements were believed responsible for the assassination. News of the president's death by a bullet in the head was immediately passed on to the top Soviet figures, this according to Russian sources. No reaction directly from the Kremlin was expected until tomorrow. Russian television broke into its late-night programming to announce the assassination. And the Soviet news agency TASS reported from New York here that, quote, an attempt was made on his life by persons believed to be among extreme right-wing elements. Of course, later they were informed that the president was dead. It's a heart-clutching thought to think of those two children in the White House, the son and the young daughter. And we can only assume, of course, that they have been informed of their father's death. Regardless of what one may have thought about the Kennedys as a political institution in the United States, they were regarded by all as being terribly vivacious and vital people who were quite alive. The situation at the moment is that the President John F. Kennedy is dead. His body is believed to be en route, or shortly will be en route, back to Washington. It's expected to arrive from Dallas at Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington about 5:30 Eastern Standard Time today, which is about an hour and a half from now. The new President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson, has been sworn in by a federal judge in Dallas and is remaining for the moment in Dallas. The President's brother, the Senator Ted Kennedy, and a sister, the wife of Sergeant Shriver, are on their way to Otis Air Force Base in Massachusetts. The family, of course, comes from Boston, and it is assumed that they're going there to be with the parents of the President. The last word we had on Mrs. Kennedy was that she was at the hospital where the President died. She probably is not at the hospital now, but we do not know where she is. Her privacy is being respected, as well it should be under these circumstances. Mrs. Johnson is no doubt with the new President Johnson. And that is the situation that we have at the moment. And do you have some more information, Bill?
Only, Frank, that there was word that Mrs. Kennedy had, in fact, left the hospital with the body of the President, presumably to go to Dallas's Love Field, from which place the body would be flown back to Washington for the state funeral, which will follow. And preparations for that, we understand, are already being tentatively made by...
Enough. Here is a bulletin from CBS News. Further details on an assassination attempt against President Kennedy in Dallas, Texas. President Kennedy was shot as he drove from Dallas Airport to downtown Dallas. Governor Connolly of Texas in the car with him was also shot. It is reported that 3 bullets rang out. A Secret Service man was heard to shout from the car, "He's dead." Whether he referred to President Kennedy or not is not yet known. The president, cradled in the arms of his wife, Mrs. Kennedy, was carried to an ambulance, and the car rushed to Parkland Hospital outside Dallas. The president was taken to an emergency room in the hospital. Other White House officials were in doubt in the corridors of the hospital as to the condition of President Kennedy. Repeating this bulletin, President Kennedy shot while driving in an open car from the airport in Dallas, Texas to downtown Dallas. Recounting again the details of this incident, 3 shots were heard to ring out as Kennedy and Governor Connally and Mrs. Kennedy rode in the back seat of the open car. Immediately, a Secret Service man said he saw blood spurt from the president's head. He fell into the laps of Mrs. Kennedy, and Mrs. Kennedy shouted, "Oh, no." Governor Connally was seen to crumple also. The car sped on, the motorcade speeded up, rushed to Parkland Hospital in Dallas, where the president and Governor Connally were rushed to the emergency room. A Secret Service man was heard to say he's dead as the president was lifted from the rear of the White House touring car, the famous bubble top from Washington, and taken into the hospital. Reporters about 5 car lengths behind the chief executive heard what sounded like that 3 bursts of gunfire. We will keep you advised as more details come in. The incident has taken place only in the last few minutes in Dallas. Stay tuned to CBS News for further details.
I've got a hunch. I don't know if I should say anything about it because I may not be right, but I have an idea that your sister has been pushing a few checkers around on the checkerboard.
Penny?
Yeah.
Are you saying you think that she had something to do with it?
Mm-hmm.
How could she have anything to do with it?
Well, Bob, what you don't know is that Penny has talked to me several times about trying to interest Neil into going back into medicine.
Oh, I didn't know that.
No, I'm sure you didn't. Well, I told Penny that if Neil was going to go back into medicine, that he'd have to do it on his own, without any push or pull from me or any other doctor, and not from her either, as a matter of fact.
But Dr. Castle,
She's talked to him too. You see, Doug feels differently about Neil than I do. Why, I don't know.
and you think that Penny asked him to?
That'd be my hunch, yes.
I'm surprised. And yet I'm not. Must we get a menu? Waiter? I'd like to order. I'm kind of hungry.
Yeah, so am I.
We'll return to As the World Turns in just a moment. I see you have a new family. Youngsters are such a big responsibility. I'm sure you'll be glad to hear about new Friskies puppy food, designed to meet the needs of growing puppies. Friskies is so nourishing.
Hospital, the Parkland Hospital, where the president and Governor Connally were taken into the emergency room, and witnesses there refused to comment on whether the president was still alive or not. As the bullets were heard to wing out of the assassin's gun, Secret Service men unlimbered their automatic rifles, but the damage, of course, by then had been done. As these details come in, let us read a few to you from the press service wires reaching us only now from Dallas. After these 3 loud bursts of gunshot, Dallas motorcycle officers escorting the president quickly leaped from their bikes and raced up a grassy hill. At the top of the hill, a man and woman appeared huddled on the ground. In the turmoil, it has been impossible so far to determine whether the Secret Service and Dallas police returned the gunfire that struck down Kennedy and Connally, or whether this couple at the top of the hill, crouched down their inert forms as the police rushed them, were the would-be assassins. Stay tuned for further details from CBS News. We'll bring you details now, more details on the attempted assassination of President Kennedy. Mrs. Kennedy was on her knees, we're told, on the floor of the rear seat of the car, her head toward the president, apparently leaning over and trying to converse with him. AP reporter who was with the group said that this man and woman we reported earlier were on a hilltop, were seen scrambling to the upper level of a walkway overlooking an underpass at which the car was approaching. Lawrence O'Brien, the presidential aide, says he has no information on whether the president is still alive. Mrs. Kennedy was weeping, trying to hold up her husband's head when the reporters reached the car as it dashed toward the hospital. Vice President Lyndon Johnson was in the car behind the president. There was no immediate sign that he was hurt. Repeating that, no indication Vice President Johnson was hurt. In fact, there was no evidence at all at what might have happened to Johnson, since only the president's car and its Secret Service follow-up car went on to the hospital. Let us recount this incident again. There has been an assassination attempt against the life of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas. The President, Mrs. Kennedy, and Governor Connolly of Texas, en route from the Dallas airport to a speech the President was scheduled to make at noon in Dallas, were in the President's famed bubble-top car, driving through cheering crowds in the streets of Dallas when 3 shots rang out. The President slumped into the lap of Mrs. Kennedy, apparently a bullet wound in his head. Governor Connolly slumped to the floor of the car. Bullet wounds were seen in his chest. Mrs. Kennedy screamed out, "Oh no!" The car stopped momentarily. Secret Service men unloaded their rifles and started into the crowd. 2 persons, a man and a woman, were seen crouched with a crowd around them on a hilltop overlooking the road. Whether they were concerned in the shooting or not, we do not know yet. Secret Service men rushed to that scene and were waiting a report on that. Vice President Johnson was in the car immediately following President Kennedy and Governor Connolly. He was not hurt as far as we are able to determine. The President and Governor Connolly were rushed to a nearby hospital, Parkland Hospital, where they were taken into the emergency room, and we have no information yet as to how serious the injuries were. However, aides very close to President Kennedy had no comment when they were asked by reporters the seriousness of the president's injuries. Late information just in. Acting White House Secretary Malcolm Kilduff was asked whether the president was dead, and he said, "I have no word now." The president had landed just a short time before, as we said, at Dallas Love Field. He was driving to the Trade Mart in Dallas to deliver this luncheon speech, which was to be sponsored by 3 Dallas organizations. The largest turnout of the current Texas tour was on the streets to greet Kennedy. He was being greeted lavishly by the crowd in a very warm Texas welcome when the bullet fired out of the crowd. Stay tuned. We'll bring you the details just as quickly as they come in. It might be recalled that Dallas has been a hotbed of criticism of President Kennedy and his administration by outspoken rightist groups. Only 2 weeks ago, Ambassador Adlai Stevenson of the United Nations was in an incident in Dallas when he was besieged by pickets, far right-wing pickets, outside